This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. What I Saw in America by G.K. Chesterton. Section 32, Chapter 19, The Future of Democracy. The title of this final chapter requires an apology. I do not need to be reminded, alas, that the whole book requires an apology. It is written in accordance with a ritual or custom in which I could see no particular harm, and which gives me a very interesting subject, but a custom which it would not be altogether easy to justify in logic. Everybody who goes to America for a short time is expected to write a book, and nearly everybody does. A man who takes a holiday at Trouville or Dieppe is not confronted on his return with the question, "When is your book on France going to appear?" A man who betakes himself to Switzerland for the winter sports is not instantly pinned by the statement, "I suppose your history of the Helvetian Republic is coming out this spring?" Lecturing, at least my kind of lecturing, is not much more serious or meritorious than skiing or sea bathing. And it happens to afford the holiday maker far less opportunity of seeing the daily life of the people. Of all this I am only too well aware, and my only defence is that I am at least sincere in my enjoyment and appreciation of America, and equally sincere in my interest in its most serious problem, which I think a very serious problem indeed, the problem of democracy in the modern world. Democracy may be a very obvious and facile affair for plutocrats and politicians, who only have to use it as a rhetorical term. But democracy is a very serious problem for democrats. I certainly do not apologize for the word democracy, but I do apologize for the word future. I am no futurist, and any conjectures I make must be taken with a grain of salt, which is indeed the salt of the earth, the decent and moderate humility which comes from a belief in free will. That faith is in itself a divine doubt. I do not believe in any of the scientific predictions about mankind. I notice that they always fail to predict any of the purely human developments of men. I also notice that even their successes prove the same truth as their failures, for their successful predictions are not about men, but about machines. But there are two things which a man may reasonably do in stating the probabilities of a problem which do not involve any claim to be a prophet. The first is to tell the truth, and especially the neglected truth, about the tendencies that have already accumulated in human history. Any miscalculation about which must at least mislead us in any case. We cannot be certain of being right about the future, but we can be almost certain of being wrong about the future, if we are wrong about the past. The other thing that he can do is to note what ideas necessarily go together by their own nature, what ideas will triumph together or fall together. Hence it follows that this final chapter must consist of two things. The first is a summary of what has really happened to the idea of democracy in recent times. The second, a suggestion of the fundamental doctrine which is necessary for its triumph at any time. The last 100 years has seen a general decline in the democratic idea. If there be anybody left to whom this historical truth appears a paradox, it is only because during that period nobody has been taught history, least of all the history of ideas. If a sort of intellectual inquisition has been established for the definition and differentiation of heresies, it would have been found that the original Republican orthodoxy had suffered more and more from successions, schisms, and backslidings. The highest point of the democratic idealism and conviction was towards the ends of the 18th century, when the American Republic was dedicated to the proposition that all men are equal. It was then that the largest number of men had the most serious sort of conviction that the political problem could be solved by the vote of peoples instead of the arbitrary power of princes and privileged orders. These men encountered various difficulties, and made various compromises in relation to the practical politics of their time. In England they preserved aristocracy. In America they preserved slavery. But though they had more difficulties, they had less doubts. Since their time, democracy has been steadily disintegrated by doubts; and these political doubts have been contemporary with, and often identical with, religious doubts. This fact could be followed over almost the whole field of the modern world. In this place it will be more appropriate to take the great American example of slavery. I have found traces in all sorts of intelligent quarters of an extraordinary idea that all the fathers of the Republic owned black men like beasts of burden, because they knew no better, until the light of liberty was revealed to them by John Brown and Mrs. Beecher Stowe. One of the best weekly papers in England said recently that even those who drew up the Declaration of Independence did not include negroes in its generalisation about humanity. This is quite consistent with the current convention in which we were all brought up, the theory that the heart of humanity broadens in ever larger circles of brotherhood, till we pass from embracing a black man to adoring a black beetle. Unfortunately, it is quite inconsistent with the facts of American history. The facts show that in this problem of the Old South, the 18th century was more liberal than the 19th century. There was more sympathy for the negro in the school of Jefferson than in the school of Jefferson Davis. Jefferson, in the dark estate of his simple deism, said that the sight of slavery in his country made him tremble, remembering that God is just. His fellow Southerners, after a century of the world's advance, said that slavery in itself was good, when they did not go farther and say that negroes in themselves were bad. And they were supported in this by the great and growing modern suspicion that nature is unjust. Difficulties seem inevitably to delay justice to the mind of Jefferson, but so they did to the mind of Lincoln. But that the slave was human and the servitude inhuman, that was, if anything, clearer to Jefferson than to Lincoln. The fact is that the utter separation and subordination of the black like a beast was a progress. It was a growth of 19th century enlightenment and experiment, a triumph of science over superstition. It was the way the world was going, as Matthew Arnold reverentially remarked in some connection, perhaps as part of his definition of God. Anyhow, it was not Jefferson's definition of God. He fancied in his far-off patriarchal way a Father who had made all men brothers, and brutally unbrotherly as was the practice, such democratic deists never dreamed of denying the theory. It was not until the scientific sophistries began that brotherhood was really disputed. Gobineau, who began most of the modern talk about the superiority and inferiority of racial stocks, was seized upon eagerly by the less generous of the slave owners, and trumpeted as a new truth of science and a new defence of slavery. It was not really until the dawn of Darwinism, when all our social relations began to smell of the monkey house, that men thought of the barbarian as only a first and the baboon as a second cousin. The full servile philosophy has been a modern and even a recent thing, made in an age whose invisible deity was the missing link. The missing link was a true metaphor in more ways than one, and most of all in its suggestion of a chain. By a symbolic coincidence, indeed, slavery grew more brazen and brutal under the encouragement of more than one movement of the progressive sort. Its youth was renewed for it by the industrial prosperity of Lancashire, and under that influence it became a commercial and competitive instead of a patriarchal and customary thing. We may say with no exaggerative irony that the unconscious patrons of slavery were Huxley and Cobden. The machines of Manchester were manufacturing a great many more things than the manufacturers knew or wanted to know. But they were certainly manufacturing the fetters of the slave, doubtless out of the best quality of steel and iron. But this is a minor illustration of the modern tendency as compared with the main stream of scepticism which was destroying democracy. Evolution became more and more of a vision of the break-up of our brotherhood, until by the end of the 19th century the genius of its greatest scientific romancer saw it end in the anthropophagous